What's up, guys? David DeCelle here, CEO of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. And I am joined today by a repeat guest. I forget off the top of my head, but I think it was 4 or 5 years ago we had Alan on the
Yep.
show. So I'm curious to juxtapose this episode compared to that one as it relates to the M&A space. But for those of you who may not know, Allen Darby is the CEO and founder of Allaris Acquisitions. And we were brought together actually by our joint partner in Street Cred. So big thanks to them. But Alan, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, David, I appreciate it. I do think it was about 4 years ago, and as we were launching Alaris, I think you may have been the very first podcast that I was on. So that was groundbreaking for me then. So appreciate it, and super excited to be back on with you.
Well, I'm happy to hear that I helped you break the ice and get your
Right.
voice out there. So let's rock and roll. So for those that don't know you, for those that may not have heard that podcast, give us a sense of your come up in the industry. How'd you get started, and what exactly are you doing now?
Yeah. Well, I was a financial advisor. I'm 56 years old today. I was a financial advisor for about 25 years. And it was nothing really innovative in my role as an owner of an RIA, typical wealth management firm. However, we did do 9 acquisitions as an owner, and this was, gosh, almost 20 years ago. So it was before like acquisitions were a thing.
Hmm.
I got the big idea, and so that was sort of how I got my feet wet in the M&A space was as an owner. And also, fortunately, during that period of running that wealth management business, I got to meet a guy named Joe Duran, who is, as you know, was the CEO of United Capital. But he was CEO when United Capital was at zero. They had not done an acquisition. It was actually a mutual money manager that knew us both, that we both used as wealth management firms. I said, "You guys need to talk because you're both saying the same things about your desire to do M&A." So I met Joe, and he actually wanted to buy my practice, which I wasn't interested in selling, and we didn't transact with United, but we became friends and stayed in touch. Fast forward about 6 years, I did sell my practice, not to United Capital, for a variety of reasons, but took about a year and a half off, decided to get back in the business, and went out to the Schwab conference to replug myself in, and bumped into Joe in the vendor hall as he was on his way to a TV interview. He had grown to about 6 billion from the time that I had first met him when he was at zero, primarily through inorganic growth. So United, for those who don't know, was one of the first kind of pioneers in the M&A space, along with Focus and Hightower. It was sort of those three were the first really big splashes in wealth management. And so when I bumped into him, I told him I'd sold my business and I was looking for the next chapter of my life, and he asked me to join their team. So I did so as an independent contractor, what the industry would call a buyer advisor. So they had, before I showed up, they were pretty much reliant on sell side advisors like we are today at Alaris, bringing them deals. I launched all their organic outbound growth. And so I started building a little team around that process. And over 7 years, we did, I think, 35, 36 acquisitions for United. And that culminated in the sale to Goldman Sachs. So that was in 2019. So I was with them for about 7.5 years. It was a phenomenal period of time. And of course, Goldman buying them meant the show was over for me in my role as a buyer advisor for
Hmm.
United. So I had to decide, what are you going to do next? And my big idea was to start a sell side advisory firm. At United, I represent the buyer, United Capital. And if you weren't a fit for United, I didn't really have anything to talk to you about beyond that. And so we decided, okay, my big idea was let's start a sell side advisory business, but with a very different approach to the go-to-market strategy than what the dominant mechanism was and still is today, which is a financial auction. We can unpack what that means. But so that's how I got from like wealth advisor, did several acquisitions, sold my business, went directly into full-time M&A as a buyer advisor for United. When they sold to Goldman, launched my own business, which is Allaris Acquisitions today.
Sweet. Um, so when we spoke 4 years ago, you had thoughts, you had opinions, you had experience in seeing the M&A space at that time. Fast forward 4-ish years. Uh, is it identical? Has it changed? How has it evolved?
Yeah.
How has that? And the reason why I ask is because and maybe it's anecdotal or it's in my own echo chamber, so to speak, on LinkedIn. But I saw M&A, M&A, M&A all the time,
hmm
and now I'm seeing organic growth, organic growth, organic growth all the time. What's the status of the M&A space today?
Well, it's much different. It was different like back in my United days from when I started Alaris, and in a 4.5 year period at Alaris, it's continued to evolve from really both perspectives. From the buyer perspective, there's just so many more of them. It really has been this huge curve spiking up to where the buyers, went back in my United days. I mentioned there was just three of us. Today, I would say there's easily 100 credible to semi-credible buyers, out there that have not only raised their hands and said, "Hey, we want to do inorganic acquisition growth," but they've actually moved beyond just the CEO and maybe the CFO part-timing it, trying to do acquisitions on the side to where they've made serious investments in their corporate development teams. They've got very well articulated value propositions beyond just, "Hey, we're fiduciaries and we'll help get you out of HR and payroll and things like that." They really have built their value proposition in a very elegant and robust way. And then the third thing I would say about the buyers is the capital availability is just through the roof. We get contacted at least monthly by let's say capital providers. It could be a PE firm or a family office or something like that that's trying to break in, to the wealth management business or niche through what they will call a platform acquisition. And so it's those three things on the buyer side have just made it a far more competitive landscape. If there are so many more choices for a seller to vet, um, good choices. There it used to be like there's a handful of really good buyers that do 80% of the transactions, and then there's everyone else on the periphery. Well, that's changed. There's a lot of really strong buyers out there. So, and then from the seller's perspective, they've gotten more advanced too. I would say it's still true today, but to a lesser degree. Like if you asked me what's the number one thing to overcome from a seller who's considering transacting, easily it's just losing control or their thought of losing control. Today they make all the decisions as the owner of their wealth management business, and albeit that comes with a heck of a lot of burden. You know, um, they've sort of posited it historically as this binary choice. Today, I make all the decisions, and therefore I'm independent. If I sell, I'm not going to make any decisions, and therefore I'm giving up my independence. That's sort of like the mental state that they all have had to wrestle with. And I think with so many transactions that have occurred over the years, not only the things that you and I read about in the City Wire or other rags, they know people who've transacted and they can talk with them about what life is like. And so that hypersensitivity, that fear of giving up control is, I think, subsiding to a degree because they recognize it's not a binary decision. I make all the decisions, I don't make any decisions. It's a spectrum of autonomy, right? There are buyers out there for sure. When you transact with them, they're going to ask you to change a lot, adopt all of their stuff, and they can defend why adopting their stuff is good. But you have to go into that pretty well acknowledging that you're giving up a lot of the decision making. But there are an equal number of buyers on the other end of the spectrum that their model is more entrepreneurial. They're basically saying, okay, we'll take the back office stuff off your plate, but we're going to leave you alone in every other area. And there's area and everywhere in between. So what we try to do is rather than have the seller kind of think of it as this binary choice, is think of it as an autonomy profile. And we've defined 6 areas of decision making. There is strategic decision making, financial decision making, staff decision making, your client experience, which would be your planning and investment recommendations, your calendar, and your growth profile. And let's unpack each one of those smaller segments and find out which ones do you really care about retaining in terms of your autonomy versus the ones you want to give up. And you'll find when you do it that way, instead of this binary, I make all choices, I make no choices, when you unpack it and get very granular, you're going to find out that there's a lot of stuff that you control today that you don't want to control because it's making your life miserable, you know? And so there's just a lot of more maturity around that. And we find it's a lot easier conversation from the seller's perspective. And then I will wrap up to touch on your one point about the organic growth thing. That is, people ask me a lot, when rates changed and the cost of capital for buyers went up, everyone sort of assumed that that was going to depress valuations. It has not. What it has done, though, is make the buyers very focused on your growth, your historic growth because they've got to make a return, right? And where the return is going to come from is in your post-acquisition growth. That's where
Mhm.
that primarily comes from. The best predictor of your future growth is your historic growth. And so they're going to really focus on that net new asset growth rate. And if you're flat, well, I'd say a lot of firms are actually negative when you strip away the market. It's very much a turnoff for buyers. Like we have buyers that if you're not like above 5-7% net new asset growth, I think the industry average is around 2.5%. They don't even want to talk to you. They could care less about anything else.
Mhm.
It's just like that growth rate is not there. They don't want you. So that's why I think we're seeing so much emphasis is on organic growth, is because most RIAs are not growing. That's just the reality of the situation when you take away the market impact.
Right. And you sort of alluded to what my next question was going to be, Alan, but I'd like you to opine on it a little bit further. So, obviously, uh, you don't get, well, I guess not obviously, but I would assume you don't get paid at all until a transaction happens, right? And you need to balance pushing someone to sell their business with you need to balance that with making sure they're ultimately making the right decision. And I would imagine that you lean more towards that and practice patience so that they do that on their own time. But with all these different setups, with all these different options, you've probably also noticed over the last few years that there's a little bit more paralysis by analysis, which causes people to take longer to make decisions, perhaps. So you alluded to it with the six things that you listed off, but if you can go a little bit deeper, how are you preparing or coaching, however you want to phrase it, someone to make a decision for a buyer that is ultimately a good fit for them?
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's a great question. The way you framed it, the way you entered into that question, I've not really heard before, which is really talking about the fee model, which that's something that I think is worth discussing. If you're going to
Yeah,
hire
let's do that.
an advisor, what value do they deliver and how are they paid? But we can talk about that next if you care to. But how do we help a seller? Let me reframe your question just slightly.
Please.
Because when you ask a buyer and a seller, what's the most important thing in the transaction? What do we have to get right? Both of them are going to say something like cultural fit. Okay. Now they may mean different things by it, but let's just define cultural fit is post-acquisition happiness for both parties. They would do it again. The buyer would buy you again, the seller would sell to you again, however you're measuring that from a cultural perspective. And so you have these two entities that are contemplating a transaction that are both saying that we've got to get the cultural fit right, but there's no way to measure culture. It's because it's a subjective experience. Like you and I could, let's say we like sci-fi movies. We both like that genre. And we go to a movie. I love it. You hate it. On paper going into it, we should have both liked it,
Right.
but we experience something entirely different. And so it's impractical, I think, to try to measure culture. And so that's where people start wrongly. Have you ever heard someone, I've heard this and it makes me laugh. They call it like, would I have a beer with you test?
Hmm.
Some say, I would like to go out to dinner with you test, and that's sort of like how they think about going into business with someone is would they enjoy having dinner or having a beer with you? What a dumb way of deciding whether you're going to go into business with each other. Because I know a lot of people that I would love to have a beer with or eat dinner with. I would never want to go in business with them,
Right.
you know,
Yeah,
and vice versa.
I think it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not like a deciding
It
factor.
it is. It's what they're talking about is the subjective part to the equation, but they're starting at the wrong spot. Okay, so when we try to help a seller get to a point of who they would ultimately consider partnering, we first start with compatibility. Okay, we make no attempt to measure culture. Culture is subjective, compatibility is objective. Okay, so what do I mean by compatibility? It's all the things that would have to the boxes would have to be checked in order for you to say this is a potential fit. So it is your fee model, your investment philosophy. Um, it could be the deal structure that you're seeking. It could be the services that you deliver compared to the buyers. It's a huge number of data points, which you could easily go down a list and determine, does our fee model align? Do our custodians align? Does the technology stack that I want align? It's all of this stuff that's where you should begin, is which buyers are compatible with me versus the ones that aren't. Because a lot of times what people do is they they go down the road of dating a specific buyer and they reach a point because all the initial meetings tend to be just introductory type things and trying to get to know each other and explore, and the buyer's trying to sell you and why you should join them and so forth. But you might get 3 months down the road and realize there's something obviously incompatible in that buyer's business with yours, or vice versa. That had you known that, you would have never spent the 3 months with them in the first place because it's just like it's obvious compatibility. So what we try to focus the seller on is one, we have to understand who you are and all the realities of your business, your partnership preferences, your deal needs and objectives, and we call it your ideal outcome at Alaris, which is basically this incredibly robust seller profile. And what we've done that I don't think anyone else has even attempted to do in the industry is we've actually cataloged the buyer models. So we have agreements with the buyers, and they are agreeing to share all of their data with us. And what I mean by that is all of that objectively measurable data. Okay. On average, I'll spend 30 to 50 hours with a buyer when they join our roster. And we'll go on site and we'll spend a day on their office and we'll record videos with them. So we've captured all this data. So when we bring a seller rather through the process, and we organize their data, we find out what they're looking for, and so forth. Um, when we get ready to take a buyer to market, this is where we differ in the mechanism for matchmaking. My competitors in the industry, they're going to run what's called an auction, and not to throw this company, FP Transitions, under the bus because I think they're really good and serve a great purpose. But most advisors listening to this have probably gotten an email from an FP Transitions, a group like that, where they're announcing like an opportunity that's coming onto the marketplace. They've got a firm in, Topeka, Kansas, and it's got these parameters with it. Are you interested in participating in this process? Well, that's the beginning of an auction. The auction says, let's invite as many buyers to the table as possible and start them bidding on your practice and use the offers to sort of score rank the buyers, eliminate the bottom third, advance the rest to the next round, repeat and rinse that process to narrow the field of buyers primarily based on their offer to what the advisor would consider a workable amount of buyers, call it 15, maybe 20 buyers, then start getting to know them, to try to determine if you're a cultural fit. And that's just a backwards place to start, because most buyers, one, they hate the auction process. Two, they're not going to put their best offer forward until they've had a chance to meet you, spend time with you, determine if you are actually a take for them. And so they know what the auction process looks like. It's this multi-round thing where they're just going to be throwing blind offers in the dark against themselves without even knowing if you're a cultural fit for them. And so by default, you're going to lose several really good potential buyers who probably would have been way more aggressive had they gotten to know you and determined that you're the cultural fit. So the way we do it, is we run a two-way compatibility screen against the entire buyer. We have, I think, close to 90 buyers now. So basically every credible buyer in the country that are on our roster, having brought a seller through the process of understanding who they are, rather than throw a big net to the entire industry to invite 50 plus buyers, we actually can score rank them on their compatibility. To tell them you are a fit on all of these, your business structure and reality, the partnership preferences you're seeking, the deal needs and objectives that you've outlined, the autonomy profile that you're seeking, expansion of services, all the stuff that you're seeking. Here are the buyers and how compatible they are with you. And it's a two-way screen. How compatible are you with them? Because the buyers are doing the same things. They're giving us their avatar, let's say, of who they're looking for. And so if you do it that way, you start by just knowing how compatible you are with a certain set of buyers. You can shrink the amount of firms that you're inviting to the process to a workable number that you can actually spend time with. Okay. So in our process, I only want to invite three buyers. That's my goal. Sometimes we expand it to five. But I know in a very detailed way why every one of those buyers we're inviting to the process should be at the table. Okay. And so by default, and I'm getting to your fee question because I thought that was a really good question. By default, that's how because you're right. At Alaris, we charge a success fee. We only get paid when you close. And so we run the risk because it takes us, it's a 6 to 9 month journey on average. It can go longer. And we're spending hundreds of hours, bringing you through this process with no guarantee that we're going to get paid. But one of the ways we mitigate that risk is that I know that every single buyer that we invite to the process, that seller is a take for them, and the buyer is a take for the seller, again, on paper. And because we run so that's like step one towards getting the cultural fit right. Only talk to buyers who check all the boxes on objectively measurable data points. Okay. Now run a smaller process where you can spend time day one, an orchestrated, very linear process designed to determine if you like one another, because that's the subjective part. So measure compatibility using these objective data points. That requires the sell side advisor to actually have those data points, which I don't think they do. Um, Now talk to the buyers that should be at the table, and let's see if we can get to a subjective, let's call it cultural conviction, where you determine, I really like these people, and vice versa. That's a far better way, I think, to manage getting it right, versus just running a blind auction, or worse, doing not just going onesie twosie, talking to buyer after buyer without any inference as to whether you're a fit or not.
I like
Long-winded answer to your question, but
no, I love the approach because I've come across other folks that they spend so much time with each other, and then on the 5 yard line, they realize something that could have been figured out before they even spoke, and it's just a massive waste of
yeah.
everyone's time, and it's disheartening to both the buyer and the seller because it's just like, wow, this was all for naught. So I like that you're requiring them on both the buy and sell side to do, for lack of a better way to put it, a bunch of pre-work that takes a lot of time, but ultimately over time they save a lot of time as a result.
We've been engaged by a number of sellers who did exactly what you just said. They've gone through a lengthy dating because they're all getting calls and emails
Right.
daily, and so they're taking these calls, and maybe a call will go well and they continue and they start progressing. One of the most egregious example is I had a one seller that they had several conversations, and they finally latched onto one, and they got like 7 8 months into the conversation before they figured out the one data point that was a massive disconnect, that, to your point, if they would have known, they wouldn't have even started talking to the
Right.
buyer. And so yeah, so if you invest a little more time up front, it will save you massive amounts of time on the back end.
So I want to try to tee up this next question appropriately, so hang with me for a moment. But you spoke about culture in that example as it relates to would we do this again? Would we buy you again? Would we sell to you again as the initial temperature check? Thinking about culture from a slightly different perspective, I've been on the inside of a lot of these large aggregators, I should say. And what I found is on paper, a lot of them look really, really good when you look at their growth rate. And, like one firm as an example, they've acquired 8 billion in 11 months, right? Looks good. And then you get under the hood and you're like, whoa, there are so many disjointed pieces. There are so many different cultures underneath the larger umbrella. And I started, thinking through and calling them sort of like Franken-firms. They were just like
Yeah.
pieced together. And so all this to tee up my thought, which ultimately my question is, what are your thoughts on this? But I can envision a world where people join these aggregators. The cultural fit is not a fit, and then they end up spinning back out. So it's sort of like this potential yo-yo on the horizon of people getting acquired and then spinning back out from those large aggregators. Is that a valid thought? Do you think about it differently? What are your thoughts in general on that topic?
So I I I bet I know the firm you're talking about, but
We'll talk
um,
about it offline.
yeah. But the the thing that I would encourage someone to do. All right, let me start with one question we posed to a seller, and it's this tension between um, wanting business, like you want improvements in your life somewhere. It could be in operations, it could be in organic growth, it could be practice management, Gen 2 training and mentoring, whatever it is. The buyer is going to supposedly deliver some form of business lift for you and the team. Okay. There's that desire, but then there's also this challenge of giving up control, like that we talked about earlier, right? And the reality is the buyer's ability to give you meaningful business lift often comes with losing your grip on decision making and control. Okay, so we've got to find that right balance of integration with a potential buyer while retaining the degree of autonomy, entrepreneurial spirit that you want. Okay, so and that often is a also a very tight correlation to where that buyer is on their journey. Okay, so like you take a buyer like a Creative or a Mariner or Mercer. These are all firms, and there's many others I could have said, but these are all firms that have done, 25, 50 plus acquisitions, very smooth integration process. All of the operational infrastructure is pretty well oiled. It's a lot smoother on the other side of the transaction, but you may have less autonomy in that world because they're not looking for a lot of decision makers. They figured things out. Um, and again, I'm not talking about anybody's specific model. Those firms I named are all great. Um, versus there are firms earlier in their journey, like the one you mentioned that has done $8 billion in inorganic growth in a very short period of time, where they clearly haven't figured out all of the operational stuff. There's no way they could have because they haven't had the time to
Mhm.
integrate and digest all of the acquisitions that they've done. Um, but that sort of me as like a common sense point, and that's part of our job is to be able to articulate to the seller the reality. If you join the latter firm that I described, it's probably going to be smoother, not as much disruption in your life, but there might not be the entrepreneurial contribution that you would want to make. They've got their way of doing things versus the other where it's earlier. Um, it's going to be a bumpier ride because they haven't integrated. However, they're still looking for people to contribute. They're trying to add leadership to their team. And there may be more entrepreneurial freedom in that world, albeit it comes at the price of some degree of chaos. Okay, so the Franken-firm dynamic for me would be as that firm has grown, and let's say they've been hyper aggressive on inorganic growth, are they is the pain of being there dissipating over time? Meaning they have a vision that they've hopefully articulated in terms of what they are going to build operationally, how they are going to integrate, um, but they haven't just got there yet. I would want to know, and that you can only get that answered by being inside as you have, or talking to partners who live there and are experiencing it every day. And if I don't mind, so that's the kind of the choice. That's a really short-winded version of explaining that. But you'll find there are a lot of sellers who are quite comfortable living in a world of moderate chaos, but also one that's rapidly growing. They're seeking contribution from these partners as they're building the plane, as they're flying it.
Hmm.
There's a lot of sellers who want that environment. And so the answer for me, if they continue to grow, they don't integrate, nothing ever gets better. I definitely see that as a potential for partners wanting to exit because they didn't get what they signed up for. But they should have known that going into it, given where that firm was on their
Right.
trajectory. Like the one that we shall not name, is just a few years old, and I think they're closer to 12 billion or so, now, and they've done that in a very short period of time, and we've done transactions with them. But every time we do one, we're very clear with the seller about like this
Here's
firm
what to
is this is
expect.
what they're not there yet operationally. However, they've got excellent leadership. They know what they're doing. I know what their plans are to build out their infrastructure that's going to make your life better ultimately, but don't expect it day one.
Right.
And so that I don't know if that's where you were going in that, but I know of firms that like I would be leery of the firm who laid out very little integration plans. Don't expect anything really in terms of business lift or improvement ever. That scenario. You might get a check, but you're not going to get any improvements in your life or
Right.
very little.
What are your one of the last questions I have today is more of a prediction. So I've had clients of mine come to me and say, and they're still early in their career, but like one person, they manage, uh, I want to say it's like 490. It's like right there at 500 million, and he's only like 40 years old. And
Mhm.
he's like, my father-in-law is in the M&A space outside of our industry, and he told me, hey, the multiples your industry is throwing around is pretty crazy, and you may want to consider selling at the top because AI is going to come in and disrupt that industry. And my take on that, and what I shared with him, is, listen, I think AI for the foreseeable future will further empower the people who are never going to become your clients anyways, the DIY folks. I think that AI, when integrated appropriately into your firm, is only going to make you more profitable. So even in the event that multiples came down, you're probably net positive because your profit is higher than it otherwise would have been not leaning into AI. And I was like, dude, I don't think you need to sell yet. Like, what are you going to do next, anyways? He had no plan for that. Um, did I give him good advice, bad advice? What's your take on that prediction?
Um, well, there's the advice and there's prediction. So I'll give you my position on the advice first and foremost. It really is a matter of that individual's like life objectives because someone who's hovering, if you look at all the RIAs in the industry, like there's this grouping, let's say at 200 million and less, and that's the majority of the industry. And then there's a little breakout to 500 million. And then there's another grouping there. And then there's like this no man's land between half a billion and a billion. And then there's another grouping at a billion. And so the way I think about those break points, if you will, of why so many firms tend to cluster at those asset levels, it's really their internal decision of staying as a lifestyle type practice versus becoming a real enterprise. And I'm not here to criticize lifestyle practices. I've seen some that are fantastic. But to to an individual who's sitting there and they're like, to go from 500 million to 1 billion, first, they're not going to make any more money or very little from a cash flow perspective because they're going to take all of that revenue and pour it back into hiring people. Maybe not as much when we get into the AI discussion, but like they're going to be investing in their infrastructure on their journey to 500 million. Their enterprise value is increasing, but they're not like taking home more money.
Hmm.
A lot of brain damage associated with going from 500 million to 1 billion as well. If you don't like managing people, if you don't like managing tech and process and all this stuff, um, you might be well better off partnering with someone who's done all of that for you, and you can just focus on clients. I will point this out that a lot of people they miss this, and I don't know why. Selling your business does not mean you're no longer an owner, right? Because in the vast majority of transactions, the consideration paid for the practice by the buyer is going to be a component of cash and typically a component of equity. And so you can still, and there's minority transactions where you're retaining a part of your business. So like there's absolutely the reality that selling does not mean you're de-risking your asset entirely and just become an employee. And you really get to choose that. It's one of the benefits of so many more buyers. There's
Hmm.
basically any type of business structure, and think of it just from a risk on mentality. If you told me you wanted to sell your business, but you wanted to do a 100% equity swap, well, there are buyers out there who will do that, and so like you can still read full risk on in terms of the asset, but now you're joining, potentially a larger firm who's got capital, they've got all this infrastructure, and you can just, latch onto their wagon as they grow you know so the advice piece would be really oriented around what does that person want to do. Do you want to roll up your sleeves and do battle and go through it, and you'll be paid for that. But if you roll a big part of your equity in that transaction, a lot of these larger RIAs, their equity is growing substantially faster than the smaller one you
Right.
know and so they get the benefit of all the business lift, plus their equity is appreciating faster. We've seen many transactions where the seller rolled 25-30% of their valuation into the buyer's equity. That was worth more than the cash they took just 3-5 years later. So there's a lot that goes into that question of is whether the advice was right. Now, the AI impact, this is something that I spend an enormous amount of time thinking about. We're evaluating it at Allaris just for our own business. We've invested well over 7 figures in AI and building out our AI systems, and um, it is definitely going to have an impact on our business in many ways. I don't yet, I'm not yet comfortable enough to like make a final, like, this is my prediction, but I
Hmm.
can tell you what I see today. Like, where AI is, it's sophisticated and advanced enough to automate a lot of the functions that a typical RIA firm does. And therefore, I think you would agree with this just listening to you. Everything we can automate, we should,
Hmm.
but by automating it doesn't mean we're turning a blind eye to it. It just means that we're leveraging a tool that can do it better, faster, quicker. And if you're not doing that, I know a lot of firms who are resisting AI, and surprisingly, it's the younger people, because I think they're worried about it taking their jobs and such. Um, I don't think we're at risk or they're at risk of like not being able to be an RIA or do their job, but I think they're going to just get boat raced by the firms who embrace AI. And so if you're not focusing on it and really trying to apply it, and I would just start at the bottom of your workflows. What is your client service associate doing? If you have an admin that's scheduling meetings and following up on, paperwork requests and all of that stuff, I would be trying to automate that using AI agents, and experience the leverage to that. Like we took one part of our business process that on average took us, I would say, anywhere from a minimum of 20 hours to maybe 100 hours of time. We can now do it in about 20 to 30 minutes.
It's
You know,
impactful. Well, that's the
that,
other thing from
yeah.
the buyer's perspective. Hopefully, they're starting to look at businesses differently and not just look at their growth rate for an ROI on their investment, but how they can make it more profitable and streamlined now.
And that's you just hit the nail on the head. That's something that I really don't know. Like historically, buyers like something that everyone freaks out, they're going to fire my staff or they're going to take away opportunity for them. That's like a no-fly zone for buyers. That's the last thing they've wanted to do is get rid of your people. They want, in fact, they're worried your people are going to leave on
Right.
the transaction. And so they spend as much time thinking about that as you do thinking about the buyer's going to fire my people to increase profitability. And so that I think might be on the table for change in the future because the buyers are investing heavily in AI and they're doing exactly what I said. They're starting with those easily automatable tasks and processes and they're eliminating those functions. Um, so the question there would be like if you have an admin person that they're all they do is answer the phone, schedule meetings, track down paperwork, that's all going to be automated in the future. So it makes me wonder in the future, will the buyer look at an org chart and say, gosh, there's two or three positions that we are not going to need in the future. And
And that
then
and the future, by the way, is between now and
now,
6 to 12 months from now.
exactly. So that's something that's concerning. Um, as a potential issue that we've really never had to deal with. Um, but there's equally if they look at a seller who has adopted and embraced AI and their EBITDA margins are higher as a result of that. Historically, the buyer would say if your EBITDA margins is north of 65%, something's wrong. You're not going to be able to grow, and therefore we need to allocate cost into that P&L to support future growth. That could change
Hmm.
because if you don't need these people anymore, because AI is like infinitely scalable on all these automatable functions, what you used to have like, every advisor could support 125 clients max, with a support team around them.
Now it
Well,
can
if
be
that
like
support team is
250,
scalable, you could
three.
go to a lot higher. That's right. And
Right.
so those practices could be worth more in the short run to a buyer, right?
Right.
Um, the biggest question of that at all to me is what's going to happen to the advisor relationship itself. And I'm not just going to fire up the old robo advisor panic that everyone went through when that came through. But the basic protective mode that every advisor assumes they're going to have forever is the relational aspect of it. You can think about it. This is the way I think about it. Let's say the advisor's value is twofold: knowledge and guidance. Knowledge is obviously what it is. Guidance is the relational aspect, the emotional stuff. Um, Knowledge is going to be worth zero in the future because everyone has access to infinite knowledge. They can be at the best knowledge at an instant. Can you maintain your fee on the emotional wisdom guidance side of the equation? And then at what point does AI creep into that side of it too? I bet you've done it because I know I've actually, I have conversations with LLMs.
Hmm.
Like it's weird. Like I find myself 2 to 3 minutes into the conversation because it's not talking to me just like I'm reading a text. It's throwing humor in there and adding
Well,
empathy and
my wife and I were driving in her Tesla the other day. We had like a 3.5 hour drive for a weekend getaway, and there was a business thing on my mind, and I just clicked on the Grok button in there and just had a conversation back and forth with what was on my mind. It was pretty wild.
well, if you don't think people don't develop emotional connections with inanimate objects, think again. My wife has a name for her car. It's like, it's like, and that the car doesn't talk back to her and know the history of her conversations and such. Well, that day is here now. And so I think advisors who are largely betting on their relationship with their clients as their protective moat, that's going to be on the table. I don't know when that's going to happen. And that I think could be the biggest disruptor of it all. So I will acknowledge I'm biased to say this because I help people sell their businesses for a living. But I'm not so sure that if I were, thinking about whether I want to do this in the next 3 to 5 years, I might be accelerating that timeline because you don't know how you could get Uberized,
Right.
with it. So,
Cool.
yeah.
Well, last thing, quick, before we sign off. One of the questions I ask all of our guests is a book that's had an impact on them. You chose Screw Tape Leathers by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And I know C.S. Lewis well, and I admittedly have never heard of that book. What's the impact that it's had on you? Why'd you pick it?
Well, I'm a Christian, and so everything.
I got my Jesus right here staring at me all
All
day.
right, fantastic. Yeah. Well, you always think about, for me, like spirituality, you always think about it like the way God would have you interact or make decisions, live a Christian life, let's
Hmm.
say. That book, for those who don't know it, it's a conversation between two demons, Wormwood, who's the junior demon, and Screwtape, who's the elder demon, and they have a subject. Let's say it was me, for example, I forget the guy's name, but the older demon is instructing the younger demon on basically how to send this guy to hell over time, over time,
Mm.
and all of the things that um, we might take for granted in choices and just the demon perspective on it, which may sound weird, but it's a very entertaining book, as to me as well, impactful, to for me, that there is a spiritual side that's working against me, and to try to look for those things, and be aware of them. So C.S. Lewis, I think, is one of the greatest writers of all time. I've got several of his books. But that would still be my favorite one. In fact, I just not before we scheduled this interview, I just read it again like 3 or 4 months ago.
That's
So
cool.
I'll probably
Yeah,
read
I'll
it
have to
here.
check it out. I won't go down this rabbit hole, but just for your own personal context, and I guess everyone else listening to this, I got baptized a couple of years ago in the ocean in St. Pete. So
Amen.
my journey has been reinvigorated last couple of years. So
That's
always
fantastic.
good to get a good recommendation for books, podcasts, etc., to keep the journey going.
That's a good one. I would highly encourage it.
Sweet. Well, if I want to follow along with your journey, if I am interested in seeing what my business is worth, if it makes sense, where should I go? How can I reach out to you?
AllarisAcquisitions.com is an easy way. There's a contact us form. You can always email me at Allen, Allen dot Darby, Darby, at AllarisAcquisitions.com, and have a chat. It never hurts to chat.
Awesome. Well, for everyone tuning in, appreciate your time and attention as always. And Alan, glad to see we were able to do this again and hopefully see you soon in Miami in person.
Yeah, future proof. Very good. All right, David. Thank you
All
so much,
right.
man. All
Take
right,
care.
cheers.